Okay, welcome everyone, our global audience, to our panel on early modernity and transregionality. I'm delighted to host this panel. I'm Nancy Simkoff, professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University, and I have an abiding interest in the early modern period, although my more recent work has taken me to the 20th century. We have four speakers because one of our papers is a joint paper. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers first. And the ground rules is that we're going to have the three papers. They are only 20 minutes. And we are asking the audience to hold the questions till the end, because we want to make sure that all three papers get presented in their fullness and that no one is cut off because of the Q&A. So that's how we're going to do it. I'm going to introduce everyone now. And then we will start with Andreas Schatz, and then with Milan and Pavel's paper, and then with Tamas Visi's paper. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing names incorrectly. And then I will moderate the questions that I believe are coming through the chat. So that's how we'll do it. And I look forward to hearing from the audience and, of course, to hearing the papers from our distinguished panel. So let me begin with introductions. Andrea Schatz is a reader in Jewish Studies at King's College London. She's currently writing a book that asks how early modern European Jews engaged with the exilic history of their times and places, and how their modes of doing history might speak to our own investigations of historical narrative and ambivalent belongings in a fragile world. Yeah, fragile indeed. Andrea has published in 2019 the collective volume Josephus and Modern Jewish Culture, which was the outcome of a funded research project at Oxford and King's College. And she's published widely on questions of language, nation, and diaspora. And last year, she held a research fellowship at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Study, the NIAS, and she's currently serving as the president of the British and Irish Association of Jewish Studies. And her paper is entitled Cities, Lands, and Narrative Geographies in Early Modern Jewish Historical Writing. That will be our first paper. I want to introduce our other speakers. Milan Zonta, again, forgive me, poor pronunciation, and Paweł Śladek have a joint paper, which is called Transregionalism and Jewish Mental Geographies in Early Modern East Central Europe. Milan is a PhD, a lecturer of Hebrew Studies at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, Charles University Faculty of Arts in Prague. And since 2017, he has been the head of the academic board of the Prague Center for Jewish Studies. His research focuses on Jewish cultural and intellectual history in medieval Christian Europe, Jewish-Christian polemics, and the study of philosophy and medieval Jewry. His dissertation was completed in 2015 at Queen Mary University of London, and he examined the intellectual diversity in Jewish communities of late medieval, Central and Eastern Europe. And he has published Czech translations of the works of Nachmanides and Shem Tov Ibn Falakera. He's currently working on a monograph about Prophet Duran and on a book proposal for a biography of the late medieval Ashkenazic Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Mulhausen. Paweł Śladek is an associate professor of Hebrew and Jewish Studies program at the Faculty of Arts at the Charles University in Prague. His research interests and publication topics include 16th century rabbinic literature, the history of Jewish book culture, and practices of reading in the early modern period. He has held fellowships at the Herbert Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies and at the Houghton Library of Harvard University. He's a co-founder of the Prague Center for Jewish Studies and a member of the Executive Committee of the European Association of Jewish Studies. And our last speaker is Tamas Visi. He received his doctorate at the Central European University in 2006 when it was firmly in Budapest, right? And now transregional, right? In both Budapest and Vienna, on Abraham Ibn Ezra. And he studies medieval Jewish philosophy, Moravian Jewish history, and rabbinic literature. So we see already that our scholars, and I think appropriately so, the periodization of their work is rather fluid. And I think that's entirely appropriate when one thinks about European Jewish history. We all know that formidable question, when is the end of the Jewish Middle Ages? And I personally date it to the 18th century, which is rather early modern of me. That's what I do because of the structure of the Kahal. So we have lots to talk about. I want to welcome you all and again ask Andrea to give her paper. And I am timing you, so be warned.
Thank you, Nancy, for your kind introduction. I would also like to thank the panel organizers for inviting me to join them in this event, which is a tribute to Elchanan Reine, as Pavel Sladek and Milan Chonsa will explain later. And I would like to thank the conference organizers for a terrific conference. And Nancy, I'm going to speak for 22 minutes. That has been agreed with Milan and Pavel. In the last decade, scholars have turned to Jewish medieval and early modern ways of doing history with renewed interest. Ram Ben Shalom, for instance, has analyzed the lively and creative engagement of medieval, late medieval, and early modern Jewish authors with Christian history. A recent conference on Sefer Yosipon has set out a new agenda for researching the formation and transformation of the work in intricate networks of reception in Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic contexts. And Rachel Greenblatt has provided us with many new insights into the multifaceted landscape of individual and communal approaches to history and memory in early modern Prague. In all these and related endeavors, we can observe a shift, a modestly articulated but insistent movement away from some of the larger claims found in Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's brilliant little book, Zachor. Medieval authors had more to say about Christian history than Yerushalmi suspected, for instance. And in light of Greenblatt's findings about the manifold, nuanced, and complex ways of engaging with the past in early modern Prague, the dismissal as irredeemably conservative of early modern Ashkenazic approaches to history by both Yerushalmi and his critical interlocutor, Robert Bonfield, appears somewhat problematic. Finally, recent research, including Greenblatt's work and the collective volume that was the outcome of the Oxford project on the modern reception of Josephus, suggests that the neat distinction between memory and history in Yerushalmi's book may need to be thoroughly reconsidered. But do new approaches to the history of medieval and early modern Jewish historical writing then converge mainly in their more or less explicit dissatisfaction with the picture presented in Yerushalmi's work, thus attesting indirectly to the latter's ongoing powerful presence in the field? I would suggest that this is not the case. The shift I have tried to outline very tentatively is certainly driven by multiple and often interconnected reorientations grounded in new research interests, methods, and technologies. These may include, for instance, moving beyond a strong focus on authoritative genres, moving beyond the strong focus on authoritative genres towards greater attention to the many small forms in which Jews chose to engage with the history of their places and times. This aspect may be intertwined with a new emphasis on gender and a renewed appreciation of the vernacular character of the Ashkenazic Historical Library, on which Chone Shmeruk and with him and after him, Chava Turniansky and Israel Batal have published pioneering work. I would like to take the title of this conference, What's New, What's Next, as a prompt to focus on one further aspect of these intertwined reorientations, the shift away from an exclusive focus on new original historical writing towards a new interest in processes of reception and transmission. In other words, there is a new attentiveness to the many ways in which Jews did history by rewriting, recombining, editing, updating, supplementing, translating, or otherwise transforming the texts they received. This interest in processes of reception and transmission is nourished by the wider fields of reception studies and the history of the book, and by a certain commitment, I would say, to the patient philological work of engaging with the linguistic and narrative details of a text, and at the same time, increasingly, also by the new world of digital technologies. So in the next few minutes, I will look at a few ways of doing history in Krakow, focusing on reception and transmission. And I will ask in particular how the printing press might have facilitated the local or translocal orientations of the historical books and booklets produced for the Hebrew and Yiddish book market between the late 16th century and the middle of the 17th century. My starting point is Samuel Böhm's edition of Avram Zakut's Sefer Yuchassin. Zakut's history of the transmission of Halacha from the beginnings to the generation of the expulsion from Spain, and his supplement on world history based on the Latin Chronicle, had been printed for the first time in Constantinople in 1566, edited by Samuel Schulam. Böhm's second edition of Sefer Yuchassin, printed in Krakow in 1580-81, retains most features of the Constantinople edition, including the historical and geographical details that Schulam had added specifically for the benefit of his readers in the Ottoman Empire, most conspicuously a short chronicle of Ottoman sultans. Böhm did refocus his edition geographically and cultural speaking by his own supplements, clearly seeking to make the work relevant to new readers north of the Alps. He added Isaac Israeli's chapter on history and halachic transmission in Yesod Olam with Moses Isserles's annotations. And he printed Isserles's notes on the Tosafis, on later generations of Ashkenazic scholars, and on the leading scholars of Poland, thus linking Sefer Yuchassin, as Elchanan Reiner has shown, to Krakow's yeshiva and authorizing Poland as a new center of Jewish learning. Elchanan Reiner, to whom this panel is dedicated, also pointed out that, importantly, Isserles's notes omit mentioning Shlomo Luria, the Maharshal, who represented a teacher-oriented, orally and locally based form of Ashkenazic learning that Isserles had rejected when he had embraced the new possibilities of the printing press and submitted his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, along with Caro's work itself, for publication in Prostitz Press under Böhm's editorship. Böhm's edition of Sefer Yuchassin thus was clearly anchored in local contexts, interests, and concerns, which Elchanan Reiner's work teaches us to understand in so many new and richly nuanced ways. Böhm's edition has a few further features that show, alongside its local grounding, also a translocal perspective. Isserles's own notes end, in fact, by gesturing towards wider horizons. He writes, citing the book of Daniel, chapter 12, I quote, "Besides these sages that he had just mentioned, there were thousands and tens of thousands of great scholars in all places, and in particular in the land of Yishmael and in the lands of the Ma'arav. The wise men shine like the brightness of the sky and like the stars of heaven forever." Isserles's quote from the book of Daniel about the Maskilim that shine like the brightness of the sky may have reminded knowledgeable readers of Avraham ibn Daud's Sefer HaKabbalah, which in its printed editions in Mantua and Venice ends with the same quote, and thus Isserles's Daniel quote could highlight the significance of the historical sketch of Ashkenazic Polish lineages that he had just provided. In addition, the brief reference to North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, the land of the Ishmaelim, will have reminded Isserles's readers of the very real significance of the centers of halachic learning in the Eastern Mediterranean, while it is also accompanied by an interesting slippage in language from the literal and historical to the imaginary, when Isserles uses the topos of the large numbers of Jews beyond the known world, a topos his readers had just found in Farisol's account of Jews in Asia that Böhm had added to his edition of Sefer Yuchassin. The threefold orientation towards the local, the translocal, and towards an at least partially imaginary global horizon, of which we could just now catch a glimpse in Isserles's words, emerges fully shaped in Böhm's editorial contributions to Sefer Yuchassin. His preface to the work praises Kraków as a city of learning and highlights the nexus between regional stability, local stability, cultural productivity, and trans-regional connections. Böhm had worked previously in Cremona, Padua, and Venice before joining Prostices Press in Kraków, and it was only in the Polish capital Böhm tells his readers that after many wanderings he could finally settle down and consider producing a historical work. Similarly, he claims it is only in such favorable circumstances that readers will show interest in historical and geographical matters and engage with them. And finally, Böhm explains that it was in the undisturbed space of Krakow's synagogue that he found Schulam's Constantinople edition of Zakut's work, which could serve as the reliable historical guide he had meant to compose himself. Thus, Böhm establishes a dialectical link between local continuity and translocal connections. In his supplements and preceding Isserles's notes, Böhm presents excerpts from Farisol's Igeret Ochot Olam that widen horizons yet further to include observations on the immense numbers of Jews living in India and even further to the east at the edges of the known maps of the world. Remarkably, Böhm chooses passages from Farisol's work that minimize the immediate messianic dimension of reports about Jews from unknown regions. David Reuveni, who had played a significant part in Farisol's work in 1525 when it was completed, is now only mentioned cursorily. The emphasis is on Christian reports about vast lands with numerous Jewish kingdoms and kings, many people, and many precious possessions. Böhm uses these reports to refute Christian polemical supersessionist interpretations of the promise that the scepter will not depart from Judah, Christians may think that God's promise to preserve his people and their sovereignty applies no longer to Jews and has been transferred to Christians, but Böhm contends, it becomes strikingly obvious that this is an erroneous interpretation if one looks beyond Europe and the Mediterranean world. In the narratively and imaginatively drawn landscapes of Central and East Asia, Jews still hold the scepter and reign over vast kingdoms. Böhm's excerpts from Farisol's version of early modern narrative geographies of a global world show to what extent contemporary Jewish interest in the edges of the world, where the boundaries between the empirical, historical, and imaginary became very fluid, was grounded in the necessity to think against and beyond Christian supersessionist claims. And Böhm's approach will remain relevant far into the modern period. Intriguingly, the production of historically and geographically informed works in Kraków continued to reflect the combination of local, translocal, and imaginative global orientations that we find in Böhm's edition of Sefer Yochassin, even after Böhm was no longer involved in Prostices Press. Just as the press was republishing Midrashic and Kabbalistic works first printed in Constantinople or Venice, thus expanding the range of genres printed north of the Alps, as I have learned from Pavel, it also issued further historical works that, like Sefer Yochassin, had been printed first in Italy or the Ottoman Empire. Sefer Yosipon and Ibn Yahya's Shalshelet HaKabbalah were reprinted in Hebrew, and Ibn Verga's Shevet Yehuda was published in a Yiddish version. Alongside these larger works, we find two short texts that reflect the imaginative geographies of Böhm's excerpts from Farisol and the hopeful visions of Jewish power associated with them. These two works are Eldad Tadani's Igeret and Isaac Akrish's Kol Mevaser. After 1596, however, the series of publications of historical and geographical works from Italy and the Ottoman Empire in Kraków came to an end. It was a troubled period for the city and Prostices Press, as Andrea Jelinkova writes, and it led Prostitz to relocate for a few years to his Moravian hometown. In the meantime, David Ganz's chronicle, Tzemach David, had been published in Prague, presenting itself as an alternative to the rather intricately woven Sefer Yuchassin, an alternative for the middle strata of the Jewish community, and an alternative also in that it refocused the historical account, again, this time anchoring it in Prague, Bohemia, and the lands of Ashkenaz. Ganz retained the local and translocal perspectives that could be found in Böhm's edition of Sefer Yuchassin, but he omitted the imaginary global geographies of an intangible East, perhaps not only due to his own intellectual inclinations, but also for reasons of political prudence. Beyond Ganz, Prague's printers engaged only in a limited way with the historical literature produced in Italy and the Ottoman Empire and reprinted in Krakow. The reasons for this are difficult to determine. Did Krakow's editions prove sufficient for the book market so that for several decades there simply was no demand for further prints and reprints? This seems to be suggested by the fact that two works that had been published in Krakow were indeed republished in Prague, but not in the same languages. The Yiddish Shevet Yehuda of Krakow was followed by a Hebrew edition in Prague, and with Sefer Yosipon, it was the other way around. At the same time, Prague had a rich and diverse culture of engaging with local history, as Greenblatt has shown, and it is possible that the Italian and Sephardic perspectives of the historical literature printed in Krakow just didn't resonate there very strongly. Moreover, as Olga Sixtova has shown, after the return of the Maharal to Prague in 1596, the publication of non-Ashkenazic authors ceased almost entirely in the city. That the imaginary global perspectives that in Krakow had been represented by Farisol and Akrish were evoked in Prague by Hebrew and Yiddish editions of Petachia of Regensburg's Sibuv fits into this picture of a focus on Ashkenazic authors and perspectives. Thus, the publication of a sizable corpus of historical and geographical texts attesting to trans-regional links with Italy and the Ottoman Empire and reflecting on them remained a very specific local endeavor in Krakow between 1580 and 1596. The activities of the Prostitz Press in this respect were emulated only many decades later in Amsterdam. I would like to conclude by pointing very briefly to the reconfiguration of engagements with local and translocal history in the aftermath of the Ukrainian massacres of 1648 and 1649. I did not have the time here to dwell on the ways in which local history was represented in Krakow in print through small publications, such as Michael Murawczyk's Hebrew account of the Gzera of Vienna. And I have omitted to mention Feivel Wettstein's publications of excerpts from the Pinkas of the Chevra Kadisha, which include historical reports and which support Elchanan Reiner's thesis that in Krakow, the Kehillah reoriented itself towards the Medina over which the council presided. The link between the local Kehillah, the Va'ad, and translocal historical orientations is strongly affirmed in one of the most important developments after 1648. Famously, the Va'ad had established 20 Sivan, the day of the massacre of the community of Nemirov, as a fast day for the communities of the Ukraine and Poland. And Yom Tov Lipman Heller, who had lived in Nemirov for a few years, had been asked to compose a new slicha for the fast day, which was printed in Krakow with a detailed account of the circumstances of its composition. Here, I will not attempt to add to Joseph Davis's magnificent analysis of Heller's slichot, but rather just highlight how the massacres and wars of the mid-17th century rendered the differentiation between local and translocal orientations or perspectives rather irrelevant. The distressing events of the period affected Jewish communities locally as well as transregionally from Vilna to Prague, and the ensuing refugee crisis was felt even more widely, as Adam Teller has shown so impressively, not the least in Amsterdam and Venice. This is reflected in the fact that for the first time, historical work relating to a contemporary crisis is not published in just one place, as was the case, for instance, with Menachem Hayes's Kina on the fire in Poznan of 1590, but work was simultaneously published by the printing presses of Krakow, Prague, Amsterdam, and Venice. In addition, the crisis rendered differentiations between the history of halachic transmission, intellectual history, if you like, and social history, and also differentiations between Jewish history and world history that had been tenuous in any event, quite irrelevant, as already the earliest Sichot show and as Natan Netahanova's Yevin Metzula demonstrates in many ways. Finally, however, the years after 1648 also show that there were limits to the delimitation of perspectives and the erasure of differentiations between local and translocal perspectives. The Ukrainian massacres did not enter the historical record when Ganz's Tzemach David was reprinted and updated in Hebrew and Yiddish in Frankfurt in the late 17th century. The printing press certainly facilitated the engagement with local, translocal, and global perspectives on history, and the printers and editors and producers' interest in opening up a market for new works and genres and in circulating them widely was certainly conducive to creative new endeavors, as the example of Krakow's press between 1580 and 1596 has shown. At the same time, the printing presses clearly functioned within wider contexts and historical events themselves, as well as communal cultures, commitments, and constraints, clearly continued to shape the direction of early modern Jewish engagements with local, translocal, and imaginary or non-imaginary global history.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I want to remind everyone, keep your questions for Andrea, and we will absolutely have time for them later, but I want to move on with our next speakers. This is a joint paper written by Pavel Sadek and Milan Zonza, and it's entitled Transregionalism and Jewish Mental Geographies in Early Modern East Central Europe.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for the introduction. And I would like to also, on behalf of both of us, thank the organizers for this, for organizing this very rich conference. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge and remind us all that this paper and the whole session, which has been organized by the Prague Center for Jewish Studies, are intended as a tribute to Professor Elchanan Reiner on the occasion of his anniversary. It hardly needs to be said that Professor Reiner's work and learning have shaped the whole generation of research in early modern Jewish intellectual and cultural history. By exploring the possible trajectories for further inquiry based on his insights, the following reflections are offered in the spirit of gratitude for Professor Reiner's contribution to the history of Eastern European Jewry. In several of his studies, Elchanan Reiner traced the revolutionary changes in the reception and dissemination of halachic knowledge taking place in the second half of the 16th century, and tried to connect them with wider social and cultural trends. He argued that the transformation of the traditional Ashkenazic methods of education emanating from the Polish yeshivot challenged the established link between halachic decision-making and the religious authority of the local community and its minhag. This transformation was catalyzed by the printing press and embodied by the newly disseminated halachic codices. In conjunction with the social and demographic changes, and with the emergence of Jewish supracommunal autonomy, these shifts have, in his view, created a new notion of religious authority. One that, together with a sense of shared genealogy and language, as Joseph Davis has shown, reshaped the Ashkenazic identity. The changes described by Reiner and others destabilized the relationships between Jewish centers and peripheries, and highlighted the deep-rooted tensions between local practice and the norms disseminated textually across regional boundaries. In this paper, we would like to suggest directions for further research by examining how this destabilization affected the quote-unquote mental geography of halachic authority in the Jewish diaspora in Central and Eastern Europe. We shall focus on the negotiations concerning the legitimacy of local approaches to religious decision-making through the example of halachic manuals printed in Prague in the early 17th century. More specifically, we're going to explore how these manuals relate to the highly influential work of Moses Isserles. By defining Ashkenazic customs and practices, by defending Ashkenazic customs and practices against the encroachment of Sephardic halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, Isserles's Hagahot paradoxically created a pressure to define, systematize, and codify these practices across the whole cultural area. To use a recent formulation of Tamara Morsel-Eisenberg, Isserles in this way, quote, reinvented the tradition he was purporting to perpetuate, end of quote. This tension between old and new is revealed in the critical response to Isserles's Kashrut manual Torat Chatat, written by Chaim of Friedberg and studied in detail by Elchanan Reiner. Chaim of Friedberg saw Isserles's work as an illicit challenge to the traditional, oral, and mimetic approach to halachic decision-making. The attempt to define universally valid kashrut practices and to write them down was in his eyes an attack on the tradition of the Jewish communities in German lands. At the same time, a close reading of Isserles's glosses to Shulchan Aruch suggests that while he saw Ashkenaz more as a methodological than a geographical label, his attitude to the age-old question of local variation in religious practice was more nuanced. In his glosses, Isserles refers to practices performed, I quote, in our city, Be'irenu, that is, in Krakow. Elsewhere, he discussed more isolated practices performed at some places, B'miktzat Mekomot. Even though these practices differed from the custom described by him as pertaining to the whole Ashkenaz, he did not suggest that the diverging local minhag should be changed. Isserles therefore clearly recognized that local identity and religious practice intersected on several levels. How does the tension between local and so-called universal Ashkenazic practice play out in Prague several decades later? At this stage, we are going to look for an answer exclusively in halachic manuals printed in Prague, although we should stress that the appearance of printed editions must not be taken as evidence for the acceptance of norms which they prescribe. To pinpoint Prague on the map of early modern halachic discourse would require a thorough evaluation of a much wider array of sources, something we can only hope to provide in the future. Nevertheless, our preliminary results indicate that while Prague retained close contacts with major Polish communities such as Krakow, Lublin, or Lviv, and these contacts are reflected in the character of halachic works printed there, it could also be seen as an alternative center, which in some areas cultivated its own identity. Let us begin with kashrut manuals printed in Prague, a genre which has already been examined by Josh Teplitsky. Throughout the 17th century, Prague printers published works that reflected the traditional Ashkenazic preference for marginal commentary on canonical works, such as Jacob Weil's Shchitot Ubdikot or Sha'arei Dura by Isaac Ben Meir Duren. At the same time, the works printed here betrayed the growing involvement of expert practitioners as authors of these commentaries, as well as the influence of the growing communities in Poland. In 1604, the Prague printer Abraham ben Moses Schedel printed a commentary of Moses ben Mordecai Braunschweig of Krakow on Jacob Weil's popular manual Shchitot Uvdikot. The edition was financed by the printer himself and was clearly intended not only for users in Prague, but also for the foreign market further east. It included approbations written by the rabbis in Prague, Poznań, Lublin, Brest-Litovsk, and other places. Furthermore, the leaders of the, quote, three lands, Medinot Poland, Lithuania, and Red Russia, Reußen, as well as the Jewish authorities of the city of Prague, prohibited the reprints of the work for 10 years. Schedel's edition was followed in 1612 and again in 1669 by two further editions of Weil's manual, this time with the glosses by Tzvi Hirsch ben Isaac from Krakow. The author of the commentary justifies his decision to compose the work by referring to his long experience as a shochet and bodek in Krakow, and he frequently refers to the practices of his community by using formulations such as, quote, here in Krakow we are accustomed to, etc. At the same time, he also explicitly invokes the authority of Israelis, with whom he claims to have consulted particularly difficult rulings, and whom he sees to acknowledge as the supreme authority. Quote, what can I do if Moses Israelis already gave his verdict? He asks. The authority of Israelis is also emphasized on the title page of the Prague edition, which claims to have been, quote, corrected letter by letter according to Moses Israelis, end of quote. The authority of this manual in Prague is documented by its reprinting with a parallel Yiddish translation sometime before 1650. The author of this translation was another local practitioner, a certain Moses called Rabbi Moshe Shochet and Bodek in the holy community of Krakow.
The fact that the practices of Israelis' home community of Krakow were in Prague reproduced not only in print but also in reality is suggested by a reader's gloss found in a copy of the 1609 Basel edition of Weil's Shchitot Uvdikot, now in the Bodleian Library, discussing the permissible proportions of the lobes of animal lungs. Weil's text, according to the Basel edition, declares an animal with a larger middle lobe than the inferior lobe of the right lung to be kosher. The Krakow edition of the same text, however, declares the animal to be forbidden. This practice seems to have been followed in Prague, as attested by a marginal note written by the owner of the volume, a certain Meir ben Isaac of Prague, quote, but in Prague we consider such animals treife, uve Prague nohaginan shetreife, end of quote. It is important to note, however, that the reader noted the difference explicitly because it was so practiced in Prague and did not refer to a particular authority such as Israelis or a particular edition of an authoritative manual. That local traditions shaped the reception of older manuals is also suggested by the publication in 1628 of a Yiddish edition of a Weil's text with the commentary of a Prague shochet named Judah ben Joseph Lieberman. The text, which was reprinted in 1646/47, claimed the support of Yom Tov Lippmann Heller. The situation seems to be more complicated when it comes to the reception of Karo's Shulchan Aruch and Israelis' Hagahot in Prague. The fourth part of Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat, was printed in Prague with the commentary Meirat Einayim by Joshua Falk, a student of Salomon Luria residing in Lemberg in 1614 and again in 1628. That the text was studied in Prague is confirmed by the simultaneous publication of mnemonic aids Ein Mishpat and Klalei Choshen Mishpat in 1614 and 1616 respectively. However, other parts of Shulchan Aruch were printed in Prague only from the 1690s onwards. The authority of Karo's Codex in Prague was clearly not monolithic, and some local authorities seem to have preferred older and more established codices well into the 17th century. Yair Bacharach, the rabbi of Worms and Mainz, recollects in one of his responsa that Pinkas Horowitz, who died in 1653, a member of the Beit Din in Prague, who used to sit in the Old New Synagogue next to Bacharach's father, quote, only studied the halachic decisions of the Rosh, that is Asher ben Yechiel, turn of the 14th century, and ruled according to them as if they were given from Sinai. He did not care if they contradicted the rulings of Moses Isserles, claiming that it, or he, was also suitable for ruling. End of quote. We should note that Horowitz was a student of the already mentioned Joshua Falk. Alternative halachic works of different genres, including halachic codices, were also authored to challenge the hegemony of Karo and Isserles. Joseph Davis showed that Yom Tov Lipman Heller's Ma'adanei Melech, a commentary to the Talmud with a complicated structure, was intended as an alternative to Shulchan Aruch and halachic codices more generally. Davis also noted that there were attempts to promote Mordecai Jaffe's code Levush Malchut in Prague against Shulchan Aruch. Jaffe's code was printed in Prague in 1609 and again between 1622 and 1624. Jaffe's code continued to remain authoritative or at least highly relevant in Prague throughout the 17th and even 18th centuries, as documented by the two commentaries on it composed by Elijah Spira, namely Elia Zuta, printed in Prague between 1688 and 1695 with Jaffe's text, and Elia Rabba, printed in Sulzbach in 1757. Spira's Elia Rabba contains multiple references to the Minhag in Prague. We find there formulations such as Poprag, Nohagin, etc. Even more importantly, in some places, Spira simply points to a ruling of Jaffe's Levush and comments, quote, and this is the practice in Prague, V'chen Nohagin Poprag, end of quote. Similar formulations can also be found in 18th century Prague halachic works, such as the commentary to Shulchan Aruch titled Bigdei Yesha by Isaiah ben Simcha Wiener, printed in Prague in 1774. Like Spira, Wiener described liturgical practice and concluded, quote, this is according to the Levush, and so is the Minhag here in Prague, end quote. In some cases, the Prague authors refer even to practices of specific local synagogues. This evidence, although partial and preliminary, delineates several trajectories for future research. This research should further nuance our understanding of the reception of Isserles's codices and of its impact in different regions of East Central Europe. It seems that the production of Prague printers and its reception in the period under consideration reflected both the growing influence of Isserles and, in the area of Kashrut, of the practices of Krakow. At the same time, Shulchan Aruch and Isserles's glosses were far from universally accepted, and the approach of scholars from Prague to halachic codification and local variation in religious practice seems to have retained a specific local flavor. Future detailed research of Kashrut manuals and their early modern commentaries might tell us more about the extent to which Isserles succeeded to shape halacha in Poland and beyond, as well as about alternative traditions that may have been cultivated in other parts of Eastern Europe. Furthermore, it might shed some light on the role of Prague as a place particularly open to alternative halacha from Poland, one that was not based on Isserles's codifications. This at least seems to be suggested by the popularity of Jaffe's code there, as well as by the fact that Yom Tov Lipman Heller, who later himself had to move to Poland, authored a commentary to Isserles's Torat HaChatat, titled Torat HaAsham, in which he quoted authors such as Salomon Luria, Joshua Falk, and the Maharal. While still a hypothesis, we believe further analysis of this material could bring further nuance to our understanding of the early modern transformation of the halachic discourse, a field of study pioneered by Elchanan Reiner, and of its transregional reverberations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Milan and Pavel. I want to remind again the audience, please be ready with your questions at the end so that we can have a fruitful conversation. I'm delighted now to welcome our third speaker to the digital platform or stage, and that's Tamas Vichy, who is going to talk about the value of the ketubah in 17th century Moravia.
Thank you very much. Can you share the slides, the PPT file, Jan? Okay, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will talk about local regulation of the value of ketubah in 17th century Moravia. But I will begin with a long overview of earlier texts and customs, and I will try to show that there is a trans-regional element in the local regulation. This will be very briefly the argument of my paper in a nutshell. So, can you, cool, okay. So this is just a nice image how a ketubah looked like in our region, in Krems, Austria, which is of course not Moravia, but not terribly far at the end of the 14th century. It's a famous manuscript fragment. So one of the takkanot of the Jewish community of Nikolsburg, which was the kind of Jewish capital of Moravia, which is preserved in a manuscript dated to 721, but presumably older, several decades. So this takkana prohibits husbands to pay communal taxes from coins that they designated and set apart for the purpose of paying the ketubah for their wives. This text emphasizes that they are supposed to pay the taxes from their own property, implying that this ketubah money was not a full-fledged property of the husband. This takkana is made on the assumption that well-to-do Jewish husbands separated coins or perhaps other kinds of property, such as jewelry or immovable property, well in advance for the purpose of paying ketubah. According to Jewish law, if a wife is divorced or she is widowed, she is entitled to get a certain amount of money from her ex-husband in case of a divorce, or from the inheritors of her deceased husband. And this amount is fixed in a marriage contract called ketubah in Hebrew. The amount of money is also called ketubah. In principle, a virgin bride was promised twice as much than a non-virgin, which is usually called widow bride. The ketubah in practice functioned as a special kind of debt, as if the husband took a loan from the wife, which he was supposed to pay back when the marriage ended. Thus, it is not surprising to see that husbands who could afford to do so designated a part of their property to pay the ketubah in case. The practice is attested in one of the earliest Hebrew texts written in the Czech lands, the Tosafot on a tractate ketubot by Rabbi Yitzhak Halavan, a scholar from 12th century Prague, who was a disciple of Rabbeinu Tam. And so here is the text. I don't want to deal too much with this. Just the point is that according to this text, the ketubah had three major components. First, a basic amount, which is 200 zuz for a virgin or 100 zuz for a widow. And this is actually taken from the Mishnah, taken from the Talmud, and this is the standard halacha. But this is just a minimal value. And then the husband was expected to include the dowry, which the wife brought into the marriage, and also to add a tosefet, an addition, which should equal the amount of the dowry. And then a third component was a matana, a gift of whatever amount. Now the next text is another Tosafist of Czech background, Rabbeinu Yitzhak ben Mordechai, whose work is quoted in the Or Zarua, again a work which has partly Czech background. And in this short text we see a vivid image of how the marriage was arranged in 12th or perhaps 13th century Bohemia. So, according to this text, on the Shabbat, on Erev Shabbat, on the Friday when perhaps the wedding was taking place, all the objects of the dowry were shown to the bridegroom, and he had to give an estimation of the values. And by stating the price of the dowry publicly, the bridegroom committed himself to include this amount in the ketubah as the dowry, so this unit what we saw before. And presumably he also added the same value as the Tosafet. Yeah? And by the public announcement, the oral announcement of the value of the dowry, the bride acquired these amounts of her ketubah, even though the document was signed only later. Now, the point what I want to make out of all these sources is that these texts reveal that the value of the ketubah was a result of a complex process of recording and negotiations. And this also meant that calculating the actual amount in case of a divorce could easily be a source of bitter conflicts. And in light of this consideration, it is not surprising to see that there were several attempts already in the Middle Ages to define a fixed value of the ketubah, which should be accepted by all the parties. Thus, this negotiation process, which was the dominant practice in 12th century Bohemia, was gradually replaced by communal ordinances, which defined the value of the ketubah for everybody in a given location. And first we find the custom to write 100 libra for a virgin and 50 libra for a widow. And this custom is first attested in the Tosafot on Ketubot folio 54b. And it has become a formula which is used in virtually every ketubah known from medieval Ashkenaz. However, the exact value of 100 libra was also an open question. Taking it literally as 1 pound of silver would amount to a very high amount. But in fact, this amount was taken as a kind of account money. This is rooted in medieval practice of trade, and it had in itself this had nothing to do with ketubah or with the Jewish marriage law. So in the Middle Ages there were two types of money. One was the so-called account money, a fictional amount, and the other, or an ideal amount, and the other the real money, real coins. And when two merchants agreed on a price, they often first agreed only in account money, and then it was a second negotiation to convert the account into real money. So if we agree on the price that some goods cost 100 pounds of silver, then we begin a second negotiation, and I may say that I have 5 Hungarian golden florins and accept this as 100 pounds of silver, but you may require more, and etc., etc. So in this way, this 100 libra in the ketubah was taken as an account money, which needed to be converted into real coins. And this is this issue is addressed in an influential responsum of Rabbeinu Meir of Rothenburg, and well, he declared that in principle the local custom should be followed everywhere, and otherwise he argued that the 100 libra should be taken to mean 100 bigger coins, like the biggest coins used in the given location. Now, the converting the account money into real coins, that could again be the source of bitter conflicts. So it is again not surprising to see that local Takka note from the 14th century on try to define the value in local coins. So not just this ideal 100 libra, but the real amount of the ketubah. And here we already see great differences between local places. So we can actually nicely distinguish three levels. So on the level of halacha, which is valid everywhere in the Jewish world, this is what we find in the Talmud. So this is this 200 zuzim for virgin, 100 zuz for widows. Then we have the Ashkenazi minhag, this 100 libra of silver. This is in principle the minhag everywhere in Ashkenaz. But then the actual value of this 100 libra, this is regulated by a local Takka note, and in this respect, there are big differences within Ashkenaz. And the next text is in a way the most illuminative. It highlights that the local differences between Ashkenazi communities was also a matter of prestige. The famous Maharil, a rabbi of Mainz, explained that the amounts in the Rhineland, in the three holy communities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, were higher than in the neighboring region of Cologne, because the Jews in Mainz had a better pedigree. They were more yoter meyuchasim. So they had a purer pedigree, and on the basis of Talmudic law, this was ground to increase the value of the ketubah. And this is where I see an important trans-regional component of the local minhag. The value of the ketubah was not exclusively a pragmatic issue. It was also a matter of pride and prestige. The region of the three holy communities of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms claimed their superiority over the neighboring regions by defining a higher value of the ketubah. The reference to pedigree, to meyuchasim in the source, suggests that Jews from these communities may have thought of themselves as a kind of nobility within Ashkenazi Jews. Now, all these developments were summed up in a 16th century halachic code that was mentioned by Milana and Pavel in the previous paper, and so I'm very happy that I don't have to introduce it. And this is the Levush of Mordechai Yaffe. And this text includes a long commentary on the actual text of the ketubah, so the Aramaic text of the document. But this commentary focuses exclusively on issues of vocabulary and spelling. The legal content of the contract is totally out of sight. And this is due to the fact that the ketubah as a document became just a traditional token of marriage, not a real contract. So Mordechai, so it was important to write it in the correct way, to spell the words in the correct way, but what are the exact implications of the legal implication of the text? This was just out of interest. This was not relevant. And then Mordechai Yaffe declares that the actual procedures and the amount to be paid are regulated according to the Minhag HaMedina, to the custom followed in the given region. So he's not, here he is using the phrase Minhag HaMedina, like the custom of the region, of the land. And it is codified in Takka note. And if an individual couple wants a different arrangement, it is possible. So it is possible to choose for a different arrangement, but this has to be defined in a separate marriage contract. So in addition to the traditional ketubah, then they have to write a separate star. And Mordechai Yaffe also reflects on the fact that the value defined by the local takkanot were too high for some husbands. In such a case, the woman may renounce a part of the ketubah in a separate written document, but this is valid only if it was arranged before the engagement. And the value, in any case, cannot go under the halachic minimum. And in this context, this archaic formula of the 200 zuzim from the Mishnah becomes relevant again for Mordechai Yaffe as a minimum under which you cannot go. And then he takes great care actually to calculate its value, and he arrives at the value of about 10 Rhenish gulden, which is much less than the usual amount in the takkanot. Now, there we have two interesting sources from mid-17th century Moravia, which highlight how this arrangement worked in practice. The standard collection of takkanot for the whole region of Moravia was issued in 1650, and it was valid in principle until the mid-19th century. Now, one of the ordinances highlight the conflict between the desire to raise the prestige of the region, and this is what I am inclined to consider as the trans-regional element, since the point was to establish a prestigious position for the Moravian Jews among other regional communities. And on the other hand, the demands of everyday realities. So the text in question defines a high value for ketubot in the Moravian region, but also qualifies this rule by allowing the inheritors of the husband to pay less in case they had no resources to pay the full amount. And this text suggests that this was often the case. So the takkana defines the basic value of the ketubah as 400 Rhenish gulden in case of a virgin and 200 Rhenish gulden in case of a widow. Now, let me add that in the year 1629, the Emperor Ferdinand II demanded 12,000 Rhenish gulden from as annual tax for the whole from all the communities of Moravia. So this is actually about 3% of the annual taxes of Moravia. So, but in case they were not able to pay it, the reduced amount of 100 gulden was paid. So my purpose, I should finish, yes? Okay. So my conclusion is that we see here a conflict between the desire to raise the prestige of the region, of the whole Moravian region, by defining a high amount of money for the ketubah, and on the other hand, a pressure from everyday life, and in practice, they were unable to pay this. So the takkana negotiates these two concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to make some I'm not sure where there's an echo now. I can't control the technology. I'm going to make some brief comments. And then, as I've said, really welcome from our participants specific directed questions or short comments to our panelists. So first, I want to say that I'm really delighted that this panel was in Elchanan Reiner's memory, excuse me, God forbid, in honor of Elchanan, whom I know and whom I've learned from, and who is just such a force of nature. So I'm so delighted that this panel is put together to honor his birthday and all of his contributions to early modern Ashkenazi culture and to halachic, the history of halacha. And I'm also very touched, Andrea, that your paper referred to my great teacher, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. So, and these large questions of historical writing, historical consciousness, and memory culture. So I think in some ways what all three papers have to some degree in common, although maybe two more than the third, is what is the history embedded in halachic or pre-modern Jewish writing? And is there not only is there a history of halacha, but what's the history embedded in halachic writing? And I think that certainly the paper on the Ketubah and the paper on the manuals of kashrut get at that. But Andrea, you also, because of your interest in the genres of Jewish writing in the pre-modern period, asked that question as well. So I think we'll probably have some questions on that later. And of course, makes me think not only the work of Professor Yerushalmi, but the work of Chaim Soloveitchik and the work in some ways of Yaakov Katz. And we can talk about the problems there too, of Katz's sort of holistic understanding of Ashkenaz. I'll get to that a little bit later. But let me speak a little bit more specifically. Two of the papers treat rabbinic textuality and book culture, and one treats more meta issues, that of Jewish historiography. And all three, however, assert the trans-regional components of the early modern Jewish past and show that there's a continuum and often a tension between the local, the trans-regional, and if not the national or the imaginary national, as Andrea suggested, and that there's a dialectical tension between the synchronic and the diachronic. And it seems to me this is in some ways a given in the writing of Jewish history, and perhaps of other cultures with such a longue durée and with such a long iterative textual tradition. And again, that's not what we're doing here, but it would be interesting to think comparatively about scholars of Sufism or scholars of Islam and how they both are local and trans-regional. But certainly Jewish history betrays this constant tension between the local, the specific, and trans-regional, and again, imagined national or global community. The textual focus of Pavlos and Milan's paper on the mental geographies of East Central Europe were these halachic manuals on kashrut from early 17th century Prague. And they show, or they argue, and I hope I got this right, that despite Moses Isserlis's commanding authority regarding Ashkenazic Jewish law, local practices in Prague differed. And there was a kind of assertion of the city's own sense, or its rabbinic thinkers' own sense of their authority. And they cite evidence that practices in Prague differed, and the city had a sense of itself, its rabbinic thinkers had a sense of itself, and they cite evidence from Yom Tov Lippmann-Heller's Ma'adei Melech, a Talmudic commentary, which they argue he saw and others saw as an alternative to the Shulchan Aruch. So I believe you're arguing that Isserlis, despite his commanding power and his very strong sense of self, actually, in glossing Karo, that he was describing his authority as, Eli Medinu, these, everyone holds by me in Ashkenaz. But in fact, it's not entirely true, and particularly Prague emerges here as some kind of alternative center, or certainly a city with rabbinic thinkers who know themselves and think strongly about their own local practices. So it raises, a real question about the reception. And here I want to nod again to Andrea's really important comment. The reception in some ways, everything, right? And the idea that over the course of history, you always look at original works as somehow a deciding feature, as opposed to translations, adaptations, modifications, in some ways goes against the very practice of Jewish history itself, which is always about reception. I mean, what is the tradition except that which is received? So how the tradition actually gets received in local settings is absolutely as important as some kind of fixed idea. The tradition is never fixed. So it seems to me that our Prague thinkers or manual writers are adapting Isserlis. So maybe Isserlis is really not less important, but certainly less authoritative than he would like us to believe. And I'm just thinking now that perhaps there's sort of a bigger problem there, or a bigger fight there, which is just between Sfarad and Central and Eastern Europe, and that maybe Isserlis is just trying to wrest this idea of codification as being only Sephardic, and in his assertion of his own authority. That said, it's very clear that Isserlis's authority is central because our alternative center is arguing with him, right? And we all know this sort of even from psychoanalysis, right? If you're arguing with something, if you're arguing with your past, then something's important about your past. So Isserlis obviously has a commanding influence. Otherwise, the local halachic manuals and ketubot and other things wouldn't have to reference some higher precedent. Tamash's paper treats the ketubah and the takanot related again to Prague. And he shows that the ketubah was not a fixed text, but the, quote, result of a complex process of recording and negotiating, again, of reception, to nod again to Andrea. Communal ordinances could assert their autonomy, and the more prestigious communities could demand higher prices or fees. Again, it's not really surprising, but it shows the importance of lineage, as you said, miyuchasim, and prestige in determining, in this case, the fees of a ketubah. So I think that's very important. The local could also mean that which is more prestigious, more wealthier, they have more power, they can assert that. Andrea's paper probes, again, the vexing continuing problem of history, historical consciousness, and memory, which, whether or not he was right or wrong, I know that's rather simplistic of me, but it just shows the continuing influence of Zachor, of Yerushalmi's book. And I think that it's important to realize that that little book, which had so much commanding influence, that in many ways the earlier chapters are really the setup for his personal conflicts about being a modern historian of the Jews, who he felt that he had broken. The rupture is his. And so, and he was not, he was a scholar of Sfarad and of early modern Europe's reception of converso identity. But I think it's fair to say that he did not plumb the kinds of textual tradition of the early modernists that you are, that many of you have done. And that's not, I'm not trying to be defensive. I'm just trying to say that I think these questions of historical consciousness embedded in the halakhic works are, he wasn't actually trying to do that, or he couldn't really do it. But again, speaking about authorities and dialogue with, the enduring engagement with these questions of history, historical memory, and history writing are in great part due to that little book, which people still seem to talk about. I want to affirm again Andrea, your assertion of the significance of reception, reprinting, modification, issuing, translation as entry points into Jewish culture in a given place and time. I think it's, we'll just say it again, I think it's incredibly important and tells us so much about the local and the particular historical moment, and really brings down to the ground what people were reading and how they were reading. So that is the process of transmission. That is the tradition, is so significant. So I have a couple of broad questions. For the first two, well, not the first two, the second two papers, the paper on the Ketubah, Tamash's and Pavo Milan's paper, I'm a little bit curious about whether or not you want to speak to the Gentile context, that is, in the development of law in that place and time. It seemed that in your works, you were focusing primarily on internal Jewish halachic development or manual development. I'm just curious if you have thought about the ways in which your actors may or may not have been influenced by, been aware of any kind of legal thinking in their own in their own place and time. That is halachic thinking always internal, or is it not? And again, I can think of all kinds of people, Elisha Kralbach, and in the Ottoman context, Jesse Marglin and others who are treating legal forum shopping, you know, how Jewish legal thinking and halakhic thinking is influenced by the so-called outside world. Andrea, I'd love to hear more from you. I know we don't have so much time about the reconfiguration of engagements with local and transnational history after Tachvatat, after 1648. And the last thing I already intimated, but you know, is there really a concept of early modern Ashkenaz? You know, we say that, but all of your work suggests that the regionality or the locality of these communities in this world called Ashkenaz actually ask us to rethink whether or not, rethink the boundaries of the concept of, quote, early modern Ashkenaz. So I will stop here, and we have 12 minutes, I think. So I hope we can get questions from the audience in the chat. Again, I'm on stage B, and I'm waiting for questions. And I guess even before that, if you want to respond to each other, you can have that opportunity as well, or respond to me. Because Jan, I'm not sure I'm getting all the chat, if there is chat. So go ahead.
Can I say?
Sure, as far as yes.
Because in a way, I want to challenge a bit what you said.
Good.
Because you were talking about the authority of Isserles, and I think that this is a rather limited feature. In my own research, I am free to ignore this whole issue of the Shulchan Aruch and this reception. This is just does not really come to the sources. It's this sort of the Takkanot as regulating everyday practice. This is much closer to everyday issues of Jewish life, and there you realize that the halacha, in theory, is in a certain distance from everyday life. So I think this principle that the Hakol Kaminha Kamedina, this was used that, okay, we have the theoretical statements about the Ketubah in Mishnah, Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, etc. But when we get to an actual issue, then the local minhagim, the local takkanot, what matters, and they don't refer to Shulchan Aruch usually. There are surely exceptions. And I want also referred to a particular responsum by Menahem Mendel Krochmal, where we can see exactly this, that all the responsum is about the correct application of the takkana. So, you know, in this context, the issue of the authority of Rema, this is a very, very, very theoretical question.
I just want to say, I don't disagree with you. I think that what I'm suggesting is that the Shulchan Aruch, that Isserles's assertions are prescriptive. Again, I have, you know, so go ahead, Pavel. And halachic thinking and Takkanot social history of Jewish life on the ground are different things. So go ahead, Pavel, please.
Yeah, well, I'll have just a very short comment, and probably Milan will have a note on something more theoretical or general. But I might go somehow back to what you said, Nancy. I think Tamas. It's, I mean, the material that we studied with Milan, I think what it showed to us, and we could not present all of it, is that the reception or the impact of Isserles is diverse. That they are spheres of the customs or of the halachic practice, where, as you say, it's maybe not really visible, or not that much important, but there are some spheres where it really is important. So we do find in the decades after Isserles and after his works were published, we do find comments such as, "We have other opinions, but Isserles has already decided, he gave his ruling, and this is how it is, and we can't do anything about that." Yeah, so one aspect of our paper, maybe it was not highlighted as it should have been, is that, for example, in the case of kashrut, there is some debate. Maybe in the case of liturgy, it's different, and there is more independence or so, etc. So I do agree with you, but I think it really is diverse, that when we learn more, we'll probably see where Isserles is really important. And then there's another, and I'm going to end immediately, there's another thing to it. Well, you're talking about the takanot, about what's very often being applied not by the rabbis, but by the local leaders of the community, while then there is the halachic discourse as such, and you ended your comment with the word theory. So I think there's also something like academic level of the halacha, and there definitely the Rema is extremely important. Thank you.
So Andrea and then Milan, and there is then a question from Adam Teller. So let's, Andrea and Milan.
I think I should wait first. Milan will certainly speak directly.
No, I was just going to very briefly just add to what Pavel said, and I completely agree. I think in a way our paper was in debate, as we've said, with Elhanan Reiner's important thesis that Isserles' codifications presented a significant break in the way Ashkenazi rabbis thought about codification of halakha, and also a break in ways that halachic knowledge was studied and transmitted. And that what we and the purpose of our paper was exactly as Pavel said, to illustrate the different ways that this actually played out, that the impact of this revolutionary change wasn't uniform, and that this diversity also had some maybe regional or trans-regional element to it. That the reception wasn't equal in all different places. So in this way, when we speak about Isserles' authority, it's more like maybe authority is not exactly the right word. Maybe it's impact that is maybe more suitable here. Because of course Isserles asserted his authority in different ways, and also later, so like Shochet from Krakow invokes his authority as the rabbi of the community. But this is not that novel when we think of an authority of rabbi in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. But what is like groundbreaking or like a new game changer is his approach to codification and halachic decision making, and how this should be approached in Ashkenaz, and how geographically diverse it should be. And in this way also we could not go into much detail, but I also think that this sometimes the impact of his work is depicted as universalizing, so he's like promoting or creating this universal Ashkenazic halakha, and we try to suggest that even he himself had a more nuanced approach, and then also the impact was more nuanced than that.
I want to give Andrea a chance. So, Andrea, do you want to respond to Adam?
Absolutely.
Okay, so wait 1 second. I just want to say one little thing is that it strikes me that the dialectic between local and then prescriptive halacha in the modern period, meaning the last 150 years, we've seen a fragment just in kashrut. So there's a resistance, I think, for a universal standard. Period. Full stop. Okay, Adam Teller. First of all, thanks to the panelists. And he says, in thinking about transmission and publishing, I wonder whether Hebrew and Yiddish printing are indicative of cultural trends in the same way. Reprinting a Hebrew book is presumably the culturally determined choice of the publisher, while issuing a Yiddish translation is dependent on there being actually a translation physically available and perhaps an audience for it. So go ahead, Andrea, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nancy, for your comments, and Adam, for your question. Before I'll turn to this, actually, in response to your second question, Nancy, for me, and the discussion we just had, explain how I see my perspective actually closely related to what you're trying to do for halacha. I'm trying to do, I think, something very similar for history, for doing history. And I think one of the starting points is, first of all, this realization that transregional or universalizing perspectives, or whatever you call them, are actually localized endeavors. That they can be very specific to one rabbinical scholar, authority, or to one communal kind of to one community, to one place. So transregional perspectives are specific to Krakow with regard to the historical library that I'm analyzing. At the same time, what I've tried to do is precisely to break up, Nancy, that I don't have to break it up, but I just wanted to confirm actually the new diversifying nuance perspectives on Poland, Bohemia, Ashkenaz, and so on and so forth. I think I used the word early modern Ashkenaz only once in my paper at the beginning, and I erased that for the spoken version because I realized that it's not actually what I'm going to address. But what interested me was precisely the complex kind of resonances or differences between Krakow and Prague, and further on Frankfurt, and just like we just heard about halacha, it's really both. Some things do migrate to other places, and other things just don't. And my third point, kind of here, complicating this, was that it's really difficult to determine the reasons for some of these dynamic interrelations and developments between places. And Adam, this is, I think, where your question comes in. So my primary example here for the difficulty of determining things is the reprints of Petachia, of Regensburg, Zibuv in Prague. On the one hand, this fits perfectly in a picture that contrasts an interest in Sephardic Italian literature in Krakow with an interest in Ashkenazic literature in Prague. But on the other hand, it may really also just have had to do with the saturation of the book market, and that there was no need to reprint further books from Italy and the Ottoman Empire. So I think I just want to put this issue on the agenda. How do we deal methodologically with this? And Adam, your suggestion is very interesting, that it may have had to do with languages, but at this point, at least, I don't see this as a determining factor. It seems to me that a Yiddish Shevet Yehuda was printed in Krakow, for considerations that did not differ that much from the considerations that made Prague printers put on the market a Hebrew version. And one of the reasons why I do not yet see much differentiation there is that these Hebrew versions of the Yosipon or of the Chevalier d'A look quite, I mean, not much effort has gone into these. They seem to have been produced not with more care and attention than the Yiddish productions. And sometimes the Yiddish books are produced with greater attention to detail and aesthetics as the Hebrew books. So I'm not sure, but I'd love to continue the conversation about that.
So we have to close. I think that what you're getting at, Andrea, and what many of us is sort of the social history of these publications, and actually getting at, as you said, causality of why in a particular moment. And I don't need to tell you, there could be a whole host of reasons, right? Prestige, the market, the flooded market, the economy, the literacy rates. I mean, these are challenging questions of the history of book and publication, but it does show the complexity of this thing called Ashkenaz, this construct of Ashkenaz, because clearly there are regional and local ways in which our writers and our book publishers understood themselves. That's it. Thank you all so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the organizers. And let's all be safe and well and can meet in person sooner than later.